Hi everybody, this is Mike Grossman and this is my presentation on exploring the syntax-semantics interface, understanding how structure shapes meaning. I'm particularly interested in the structure of language, so I wanted to do something on syntax and semantics and how these two areas relate to one another. And I discovered through the research that semantics isn't very much dependent on the syntax of the language. If the syntax is meaningless or ambiguous, it's going to make the semantics ambiguous or meaningless as well. So in this presentation, I will go over some key definitions. I will discuss basic principles and phenomena in the interface. I will talk about competing approaches to the interface and the implications for the L2 classroom. Keep in mind that syntax and semantics are vast areas in linguistics. So this is really meant to give you an overview of the syntax-semantics interface and how it defines our language communication. So let's talk about some key definitions in the syntax-semantics interface. First, what is syntax? Syntax is just basically the way that words are ordered in a sentence. Longman defines syntax as the way that words are arranged to form sentences or phrases or the rules of grammar which control this. In English, the word order follows a pretty rigid subject-verb-object sequence. So if you have a sentence like called Mary John, we know that that doesn't really make syntactic sense in English. We may understand what it means, but that's just not traditional English syntactic structure. About the only person I can think of that can get away with a different structure is Yoda, who, as we know, often puts the object before the subject and the verb. And let's talk about semantics. What is semantics? Semantics is the study of the meanings of words and phrases. We know that in English, verbs require a noun phrase to be used grammatically. So a sentence like John called Mary has both syntactic and semantic meaning. So now if we put these two together, we have something called the syntax-semantics interface. And that refers to those aspects of syntactic structure that have an effect on meaning composition and those aspects of meaning that have systematic effects on syntactic structure. So it basically means that syntax or structure and meaning relate to one another. So take these two sentences, they're very basic. You have John called Mary and Mary called John. Each of these sentences have the exact same three words, but they're in a different order. In the first one, you've got John ahead of the verb and Mary after the verb. And by that structure, we understand that John is the actor and Mary is the recipient. And if you reverse Mary and John in the next sentence, we now understand semantically from this structure that Mary is the actor and John is the recipient. So the hypothesis of all of this is that the syntax-semantics interface plays a crucial role in shaping language comprehension and production. It influences how people construct meaning from linguistic input and express ideas through language. And by investigating the interface from multiple perspectives, which we're going to talk about in this presentation, and applying its principles to language teaching and research, we can deepen our understanding of language as a dynamic system of communication. So let's talk about some of the basic principles of the syntax-semantics interface. One of them is something called compositionality, otherwise known as Frege's principle, after the German philosopher Gottlob Frege. And it basically says that the meaning of complex expressions is determined by the meaning of its constituent parts. So we have some examples here of how little words in the syntactic structure carry so much meaning. So in the first example, you have the sentence, she ate very quickly. The adverb very intensifies the adverb quickly. So we understand by the composition of this phrase that very means that she ate at a very high rate of speed. Or in the next example, you've got all cows eat grass. The word all quantifies the word cows. So we understand from this three-letter word that this refers to every member in the set of cows eats grass. And in the final example, you have John and Mary went to the store. The conjunction and combines the meaning of John went to the store and Mary went to the store so that we understand that John and Mary both went to the store. So in all of these examples, the meaning of the whole sentence is composed from the meaning of its individual parts according to the rules of syntax. And this illustrates how compositionality plays out at the syntactic semantic level. So the next principle I'd like to talk about is called binding. So binding refers to the way that pronouns or variables in a sentence are linked to their antecedents or references. So here's some examples of how that looks. So in the first example, it says, John said he was coming over. In this sentence, we understand that the pronoun he is bound to the subject John. So we know that John is talking about himself when it says John said he was coming over. In the next sentence, you've got a reflexive pronoun, herself. Herself is bound to the subject Mary. So when the sentence says Mary injured herself running, we know that the person injured is Mary. And in the last example, the children played with their toys. There is bound to children. So that indicates a possessive pronoun that relates back to the children. So in each of these examples, binding plays a crucial role in determining the relationship between pronouns and antecedents within the sentence, and it's how we understand what those pronouns relate to. So the next principle I discuss is something called scope. So scope refers to the range over which certain operators or quantifiers apply their semantic effects within a sentence. So scope is very important for understanding the meaning of a sentence correctly. So in these examples, you've got examples of scope. So in the first one, every student likes some class. The scope of every is limited to the noun student, whereas the scope of some is limited to the noun class. And we understand the meaning of this sentence that for every student, there is at least one class that they like. In the next example, you've got no one likes rainy days. Here you've got an example of negation, and here the negation is no one, and that has scope over the phrase likes rainy days. And the meaning from this is that there is nobody who likes rainy days. And in the last example, you've got a modal, and here it says John can speak Spanish, and the modal has scope over speak Spanish, and that tells us semantically that John has the ability to speak Spanish. So scope has a very big impact on how we interpret language. So in the next few slides, I will talk about some of the phenomena we see in the syntactic-semantic interface. And the first one I'd talk about here is structural versus lexical ambiguity. And this is just an example of how much structure can affect meaning or lead to misinterpretations. So lexical ambiguity and structural ambiguity are two types of ambiguity that's commonly found in language, and we see this all the time. Structural ambiguity occurs when a sentence or phrase has multiple interpretations due to its structure, and in this kind of situation, you might need to rephrase the sentence, provide more context. You might have to change the punctuation to make the meaning clear, because if you don't, it can result in confusion, different interpretations of the same sentence. So here's a perfect example. The girl saw the dog with her new glasses. So this could be interpreted to mean either that the girl was wearing new glasses when she was looking at the dog, or the girl saw the dog in possession of her new glasses. So this is an example where the ambiguity of this sentence gives rise to multiple meanings. And then we have lexical ambiguity, and that occurs when you've got a word or phrase that's got multiple meanings. And again, you'd have to rely on context, surrounding words, or additional information to understand what the meaning of the sentence is. So these are examples of how the semantics interface can help us avoid misunderstandings by being clear in our language. Okay, so it shouldn't just surprise us if we have a concept like scope, we can have something called scope ambiguity. So scope ambiguity refers to the phenomenon where the interpretation of quantifiers or other operators is ambiguous due to the potential scopes within a sentence. So unlike the previous example, such sentences are syntactically logical, but semantically ambiguous. So here's some examples of that. So in the first example, we've got quantifier scope ambiguity. Every student didn't pass the exam. In this situation, ambiguity arises over the scope of negation. The sentence could mean, not every student passed the exam if the scope of negation is over every student, or every student failed the exam if the scope of negation is over past the exam. In the next example, we've got an example of adverbial scope ambiguity. She only reads books. Okay, in this situation, ambiguity arises over the scope of the adverb only. Do we mean that she only reads books and nothing else? Or are we saying that she only reads books and doesn't do anything else with them, if only refers to reads? And the last example, we've got an example of modal scope ambiguity. She might have to leave early. This is a little more subtle, this one, but ambiguity could arise here because it could mean it's possible that she has to leave early, or she may be required to leave early out of some sort of duty or obligation, some kind of external factor. So next we have examples of discrepancies between surface structure and logical form in the syntactic-semantic interface. So this refers to situations where the way a sentence is structured doesn't perfectly align with its logical representation or semantic meaning. And we've already seen this in previous slides with the syntactic ambiguity and scope ambiguity. And we also see it with syntactic transformations. So a sentence like Mary read the book, that follows our standard, subject, verb, object sequence. But we can say in English, the book was read by Mary. It's a passive construction, perfectly acceptable syntactically, but it's a different structure, but it doesn't change the logical meaning of the sentence. We still understand from that sentence that Mary is the actor of the verb reads. And in this last example, we have an ellipsis. So here we've got John likes Diet Mountain Dew, and so do I. And here, the surface structure of that second clause is missing the verb like, but we still understand from the context that John likes Diet Mountain Dew, and I like Diet Mountain Dew, which I really do. So these are examples of how discrepancies between surface structure and logical form can give rise to different linguistic phenomena, which can lead to ambiguity or misinterpretation of the sentence. So I said at the outset of the presentation that there were competing approaches among linguistic theorists to the syntax-semantics interface. And this shouldn't really surprise us because throughout this course we have seen competing views about different language areas among language theorists. And it's no different here. So in my research, I discovered that the two approaches are called the functionalist and the formalist approaches. So the functionalist approach focuses on how the language structure serves communicative functions in real-life context. So an example like, could you save me a seat? Functionalists would look at that word could, the modal, and say, well, that's really used to convey the speaker's politeness and respect for the listener. And I think we all understand that. Formalist approach focuses on abstract and formal rules. They don't really concern themselves with the pragmatics of the sentence. So while functionalists look to semantics and pragmatics to explain syntactic phenomena, formalists try to limit themselves to the syntax themselves. And they've got some support in this in something called the autonomy of syntax. So if you take a sentence like, the potato sang a lullaby to the refrigerator, we know that semantically that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but syntactically it's perfectly acceptable. So these different approaches, they're kind of reminiscent of what Hughes talks about in our book about the rationalist versus the empiricist approaches. So functionalists would find empirical data more important when it comes to the real world language, whereas formalists would prioritize abstract rules and formal rules rather than empirical observations. So what are the implications of the syntax-semantics interface for the L2 classroom? How can teachers use this interface to help their L2 learners? Well, I've suggested a few options. So teachers can integrate syntax and semantics to provide a more holistic language teaching experience for their learners. They can enhance grammar instruction by pointing out not only syntactic forms, but also the semantic meaning that goes along with those forms. They can help their learners acquire vocabulary by emphasizing not only how words are used in syntactic structures to convey meaning, but also the semantic nuance of words, because we all know that different words can have different nuances. They can develop communicative competence by encouraging learners to focus not only on grammatical accuracy, but also conveying the intended meanings. And then they can use technology and applications to help students understand syntactic structures in meaningful semantic contexts. So in summary, I think it's helpful to think of the syntax-semantics interface like a tree. The roots and branches create what we see and understand to be a tree. So at the outset of the presentation, I stated the hypothesis, and I have it restated here. The syntax-semantics interface plays a crucial role in shaping language comprehension and production, influencing how individuals construct meaning from linguistic input and express their ideas through language. By investigating this interface from multiple perspectives and applying its principles, both in the classroom and the research, we can deepen our understanding of language as a dynamic system of communication. And that leads us to our conclusion. By grasping the fundamentals of the syntax-semantics interface, including, as we've seen, compositionality, binding, and scope, individuals gain a deeper understanding of how language is structured and imbued with meaning. Additionally, being attuned to interface phenomena like structural and lexical ambiguity helps prevent misinterpretations and promotes more effective communication. And I would say that integrating both functionalist and formalist perspectives into the study of syntax-semantics interface not only enriches theoretical linguistics, but also yields tangible benefits in the L2 classroom. This integration enhances language learning outcomes and cultivates stronger communication skills among learners. So that's it for my presentation on the syntax-semantics interface. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, you can click on any of my links on the reference page that follows. Thank you so much for listening.